The courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that crawled under your skin, the kind that made your heartbeat feel too loud. Everyone was frozen, eyes wide, breaths held. Judge Naomi Carter stood firm behind the bench, her black robe flowing around her like the armor of a warrior. But it wasn't just any day in court. No, today, a storm had erupted in the form of Officer Travis Miller, a white cop with a history of using his badge to bully black folks. He had lost control. The moment had started with an argument, a disagreement that should have stayed within words. But in front of the entire courtroom, Officer Miller had snapped. His face had gone red with rage, his hand had twitched toward his belt, and before anyone could process what was happening, he had lunged at her. A cop had just attacked a judge, a black woman, right in her own courtroom. The audience gasped. The bailiffs hesitated. And then, before anyone could stop it, Naomi fought back. The impact sent a chair flying. Papers scattered into the air. Officer Miller's hand reached for her wrist, but Naomi twisted out of his grip. He wasn't expecting that. He wasn't expecting her to be strong. Before he could react, she struck back. A sickening crack echoed through the room. Then, screams. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Lawyers scrambled, jurors stood up, and officers rushed in. But it was too late. The damage had been done. And now, as the dust settled, all eyes were on Naomi. On Judge Carter. What had just happened? It had started like any other day. Naomi Carter woke up at 5:30 a.m., just like always. She stretched, rolled her shoulders, and got out of bed. Today was a big day. Another high-profile case was on her desk, and she had no time for nonsense. She brewed her coffee, glanced at the news playing on her TV, and sighed when yet another story about police violence flashed on the screen. Another black man beaten. Another officer justified in his actions. She turned it off. She couldn't let that get into her head before court. By 7 a.m., she was in her car, dressed in a navy blue suit beneath her robe, her long black hair neatly pinned up. The courthouse was already busy when she arrived. Lawyers were walking in and out, reporters were hovering, and the staff greeted her with their usual respect. Naomi Carter was known for her no-nonsense attitude in court. She didn't take sides, she followed the law. But she also knew the law wasn't always fair. And today, she was about to deal with someone who didn't respect it at all. Officer Travis Miller. She had heard his name before. There were whispers, complaints that had gone missing, victims who were too scared to come forward. He had been in the news last year for an incident involving a young black delivery man, but the case was mysteriously dismissed. Now, he was standing trial for excessive force. Naomi had read the files. The victim was a 19-year-old black college student named Jamal Rivers. He had been walking home when Officer Miller stopped him, accused him of looking suspicious, and within minutes, Jamal was on the ground, beaten so badly that he was in the hospital for 2 weeks. Miller claimed Jamal had resisted, but the security footage said otherwise. This case was different. There was video evidence, and Naomi knew that the moment Miller stepped into her courtroom, he would not like answering to a black judge. The trial started as expected. Miller sat at the defense table, looking too comfortable, like he didn't believe for a second that anything bad would happen to him. Jamal's lawyer, a sharp and fearless woman named Vanessa Clark, presented the evidence. The footage played on the screen for everyone to see. The courtroom watched in horror as the video showed Miller slamming Jamal against a wall, punching him, and then laughing about it with his partner afterward. Naomi's jaw clenched. This wasn't just misconduct. This was pure hatred. Miller didn't flinch. He didn't show an ounce of regret. And then, as the trial continued, Naomi noticed something. Miller was staring at her. Not just looking. Staring. His eyes were filled with something dark. Something dangerous. He hated that she was the one in charge. The moment things exploded, it happened fast. Vanessa grilled Miller with questions. He was getting frustrated. His lawyer tried to object, but Naomi overruled it. Then, Vanessa asked a question that made him snap. Officer Miller, when you attacked Jamal Rivers, did you do it because he was black? Silence. Miller's nostrils flared. His jaw tightened. And then, he turned toward Naomi. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice laced with venom. This whole thing is a damn joke. I don't have to listen to this from you. Naomi sat straight. You will answer the question, Officer Miller. His fingers twitched. His shoulders squared. Something was building in him. And then, he stood up. You know what? he growled, stepping toward her. I don't take orders from people like you. The courtroom gasped. Naomi's bailiffs didn't move. They were caught off guard. But Naomi wasn't. Before anyone could blink, Miller lunged at her. The moment his hands reached for her, Naomi moved. She wasn't just a judge. She had trained in self-defense for years. She struck back. A sharp elbow to his ribs. A hard step to his knee. Miller stumbled. He wasn't expecting this. Naomi didn't hesitate. She hit him again. The force of the impact sent him crashing into the judge's bench. And then, the courtroom erupted. Gasps. Screams. People standing, phones recording. Bailiffs finally snapped out of it and rushed in, but it was too late. Naomi Carter had just taken down a racist cop in her own courtroom, and the world had just watched it happen. As the dust settled, the entire room stood in shock. Officer Miller groaned on the floor, clutching his side. Naomi stood tall, breathing hard, her hands clenched into fists. The courtroom door burst open. More officers rushed in. Reporters whispered. The trial was no longer just about Jamal Rivers. Something far bigger had just begun, and Naomi Carter knew. This was only the beginning. For a moment, there was only silence. Officer Travis Miller groaned on the floor, one hand clutching his ribs, the other gripping the edge of the judge's bench. His face twisted with rage and humiliation. This was not how he expected things to go. Judge Naomi Carter stood above him, her chest rising and falling, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Her fists were still clenched, but her face remained calm. She refused to let him see her shaken. The courtroom was still frozen in shock. Then, chaos erupted. "Somebody get him out of here," one of the attorneys shouted. "Did you see that?" Phones were out, cameras rolling. Every person in that courtroom had just witnessed something that would be all over the news before the hour was up. The bailiffs, finally regaining their senses, rushed toward Officer Miller. Two of them yanked him up by the arms, forcing him to stand. He glared at Naomi, his lip curling like a caged animal. "This ain't over," he spat. Naomi didn't blink. She stepped forward, voice like steel. "It was over the moment you put your hands on me, Officer Miller." The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Then, another explosion. Miller lashed out. With a violent jerk, he swung his elbow into one of the bailiffs, knocking the man backward. Gasps filled the room. He tried to pull free, but he wasn't fast enough. This time, the other officers reacted. Hard. One of them tackled him, slamming him against the defense table. A lawyer shrieked. Papers flew everywhere. Another officer grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back. "Get off me," Miller roared. His voice was full of pure, unfiltered rage. Naomi had seen this before. The moment when a racist man loses his mask and all that's left is the hatred he had been holding inside. The officers didn't let him go. Within seconds, they had him in cuffs. The crowd exploded. "I can't believe this is happening. This is unreal. Did she really just take him down?" Vanessa Clark, Jamal's lawyer, turned to Naomi, eyes wide. "Judge Carter, are you okay?" Naomi finally exhaled. Her body was still buzzing, but she refused to let it show. She nodded once. "I'm fine." Miller laughed bitterly as he was being dragged out. His face was red with anger. His reputation, his entire career, had just been shattered. "This is a damn setup," he spat, his voice echoing in the courtroom. His eyes burned into Naomi's. "You think you've won? You think this is over? You're making a big mistake." Naomi held his gaze. She wasn't afraid. "The only mistake here," she said, voice cold, "was you thinking you could get away with this." With that, the officers dragged him out of the courtroom, his curses fading into the hallway. The heavy doors slammed shut, and just like that, the room exhaled. After the courtroom emptied, Naomi sat in her chambers, her hands resting on the dark wooden desk. She could still feel the weight of what had just happened. A white police officer had attacked a black judge. In broad daylight. In front of witnesses. On camera. It wasn't just a shocking moment. It was history. Her phone buzzed. A message from her clerk, Denise. "The press is outside. They want a statement. The whole city is talking about this." Naomi sighed. Of course they were. Something like this didn't happen without consequences. There was a knock on the door. Before she could respond, Vanessa Clark walked in. The lawyer looked tense. "Judge Carter, we need to talk." Naomi motioned for her to sit. "What's on your mind?" Vanessa hesitated. Then she leaned forward. "That man, Miller, he's dangerous." Naomi nodded. I know. No, Vanessa insisted. I mean, he's really dangerous. I've been digging into him for months, and you wouldn't believe what I found. Naomi's brows furrowed. What do you mean? Vanessa swallowed. There's more to this than just Jamal's case. I think Miller is part of something much bigger. And after today, after what just happened in that courtroom, I think you might be in danger. Naomi's stomach tightened. Danger. That word carried weight, and she knew Vanessa wasn't the kind of woman to exaggerate. She leaned forward, locking eyes with Vanessa. Tell me everything. Hours later, Naomi sat in her car, parked outside her house. She had too much to process. Vanessa had told her things that made her blood run cold. Whispers of corruption, evidence that had disappeared, names of officers who had been protected despite clear proof of their crimes. And Miller? He wasn't just a racist cop. He was part of something much deeper. Naomi gripped the steering wheel, exhaling slowly. She had stepped into something bigger than she realized. And if Miller had friends in high places, then today's fight was just the beginning. She got out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement. The street was quiet, the night air cool. She lived in a gated community, safe, private. But tonight, for the first time, she didn't feel safe. As she approached her front door, she reached for her keys, then froze. Something was wrong. Her door was slightly open. A chill ran down her spine. She had locked it this morning. She slowly stepped back, heart hammering. Someone had been inside. Then, from inside the dark house, a floorboard creaked. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. For a split second, Naomi Carter didn't move. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing like a warning siren in her ears. The door was open. Someone had been, or still was, inside. Then, another sound. A faint shuffle. The kind you'd only hear if someone was trying not to be heard. Naomi's breath came slow and controlled, her years as a judge teaching her how to remain composed even in the most intense situations. But this was different. This wasn't a courtroom. This was her home, her sanctuary, and someone had violated it. She took a cautious step back onto the porch, her fingers gripping her keys like a weapon. Her eyes flicked toward her car. She could run, call for help, but something in her refused to turn her back. She had already fought one battle today. If this was another one, then so be it. She wasn't going to be afraid. Carefully, she reached into her purse and pulled out the small handgun she carried for protection. Being a judge, she had made plenty of enemies. She had never wanted to use it, but tonight, she might have to. With slow, steady movements, she pressed her palm against the door and pushed it open wider. The house was dark, too dark. Normally, she left a lamp on in the hallway. Tonight, it was off. That meant whoever was inside had been here long enough to turn off the lights. They had been waiting. Naomi stepped inside, every muscle in her body tight. The air was thick with silence. Then, a shadow moved. Her grip tightened on the gun. Who's there? Silence. Then, a rush of movement. A figure lunged from the darkness. Naomi reacted instantly. She sidestepped, raising the gun, her finger hovering over the trigger. The intruder crashed into the wall behind her, cursing under his breath. He was fast, but Naomi was faster. She whipped around and aimed directly at his chest. Don't move. The man froze. His face was hidden under a black ski mask, his breathing heavy. He hesitated, eyes darting toward the door, as if deciding whether to run. Take off the mask, Naomi ordered. The man didn't move. Click. She cocked the gun. I said take it off. Slowly, the intruder lifted the mask. The sight made her stomach drop. She recognized him. Officer Travis Miller's partner. Officer Daniel Hayes. Naomi didn't lower her weapon. Hayes, a tall, muscular white man in his late 40s, stood before her, his face partially lit by the faint streetlight filtering through the window. His jaw was tight, his blue eyes filled with something between hatred and amusement. You don't want to do this, Judge, he said, his voice low and even. Naomi didn't blink. And you don't want to be caught breaking into my house. What the hell are you doing here? Hayes smirked, making sure you get the message. What message? He tilted his head. Stay in your lane. The words made her grip the gun even tighter. This is about Miller. It wasn't a question. She already knew. Hayes gave a slow, mocking clap. You're a sharp one, Judge Carter. Naomi's blood boiled. He attacked me in open court. There's video evidence. He's going to prison. Hayes laughed. Laughed. That's cute, he said. You really think one bad day is going to bring him down? You don't get it, do you? Naomi's fingers twitched against the trigger. Then explain it to me. Hayes took a slow step forward. I think you already know, Judge. This city? The system? It's built for guys like us. Miller made a mistake today. Yeah, but trust me, he's got friends in high places. And those friends. He leaned in slightly. They don't like you. Naomi didn't flinch. I don't like them either. Hayes chuckled. That's a problem. You see, the people I work for, they handle problems. She clenched her jaw. Like you tried to handle Jamal Rivers? Hayes's smile faded. You should have dropped his case, he said. We made it clear. But you just had to make it a spectacle, didn't you? Had to put Miller on trial. Had to humiliate him. And now? His eyes darkened. Now, you made things personal. Naomi's pulse pounded in her ears. You came here to scare me, she said. But you made one mistake. Hayes raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Naomi took a step forward, pressing the gun against his chest. You broke into the wrong damn house. For the first time, Hayes hesitated. Then, sirens. Loud. Close. Getting louder. Hayes's eyes flickered with something like panic. Naomi smirked. Guess you're not as untouchable as you think. Headlights flashed through her windows. The sound of tires screeching to a stop filled the air. Hayes's jaw clenched. You called the cops? Naomi tilted her head. What was it you said earlier? Oh, right. I don't have to listen to people like you. Hayes let out a slow breath. Then he moved. Before Naomi could react, he swung his arm, knocking the gun from her grip. It skidded across the floor. She struck back instantly, a hard elbow to his ribs. Hayes staggered but didn't fall. She went for another hit, but this time, he caught her wrist. You should have stayed quiet, he growled. Naomi twisted, breaking free. She kicked hard, sending him stumbling backward. Then, her front door burst open. Freeze. Hands up. Several officers stormed in, weapons drawn. Hayes didn't even try to run. He raised his hands slowly, that smug smirk creeping back onto his face. Well, he muttered. Looks like I'm in trouble. Naomi wiped blood from her lip. Damn right you are. The officers grabbed him, shoving him against the wall. Naomi could tell some of them knew him, knew exactly who he was. But tonight, that badge wouldn't protect him. One of the officers looked at her. Judge Carter, are you okay? Naomi took a deep breath. She should have felt relief. But she didn't. Because deep in her gut, she knew. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The flashing red and blue lights painted Naomi's house in eerie colors, making the whole street look like a crime scene. A crime scene at her home. She stood on the front steps, arms crossed, as the officers hauled Officer Daniel Hayes into the back of a squad car. His hands were cuffed, but that smug look hadn't left his face. Naomi's jaw clenched. Even in cuffs, he didn't look worried. That was the problem. Two officers approached her, one black, one white. She recognized them. Detectives Eric Lawson and Mike Hendricks. They had been in her courtroom before, usually on cases dealing with corrupt cops. Tonight, they looked uncomfortable. Lawson spoke first. Judge Carter, we need to take your statement. Naomi nodded. Let's do it inside. The three of them stepped into her home. The damage was clear. Drawers left open. Papers thrown everywhere. Whoever had been here wasn't just trying to scare her. They had been searching for something. Naomi swallowed her anger. She needed to be calm. Focused. They sat in her living room. Lawson pulled out his notepad. Tell us everything that happened. Naomi didn't hold back. She told them how she found the door open. The noises inside. How Hayes attacked her. How she fought back. Lawson listened, nodding occasionally. Hendricks, however, looked uneasy. When Naomi finished, he rubbed his chin. Judge, I don't want to sound negative, but do you really think Hayes acted alone? Naomi stiffened. She had been thinking the same thing. No, she said finally. This wasn't random. It's connected to Miller. Lawson frowned. You think Miller sent him? I think Miller and Hayes are part of something bigger, Naomi said. And they don't want me to dig deeper. Hendricks and Lawson exchanged a look. Then Lawson sighed. Judge, there's something you should know. Naomi narrowed her eyes. What? Lawson hesitated. Then he leaned forward. We've been looking into Miller for a while now. You're right. He's not just a racist cop. He's involved in something much worse. Naomi's pulse quickened. How bad? Hendricks shifted in his seat. Bad enough that a lot of people want to keep him protected. Lawson nodded. Miller has ties to dirty cops, drug dealers, and even city officials. He's been moving in the shadows for years. Every complaint against him disappeared. Every investigation shut down. Naomi felt a chill run down her spine. This trial, Lawson continued, was the first time Miller was actually being held accountable. And then today happened. Naomi exhaled slowly. You think today was planned? Lawson nodded. 100%. Miller didn't just snap in court. He knew exactly what he was doing. The attack was meant to do two things: scare you and shift the narrative. Naomi frowned. Shift the narrative? Hendricks sighed. Judge, the media isn't calling this a case of a racist cop attacking a judge. They're calling it a courtroom brawl. Naomi's stomach sank. She grabbed her phone, pulling up the news. And there it was. Headline: Chaos in the courtroom. Judge and police officer in physical altercation. Another: tensions rise as Judge Naomi Carter and Officer Travis Miller clash in court. The articles twisted everything. They made it sound like she and Miller had both lost control, like she was just as guilty as him. Anger burned in her chest. This is exactly what they wanted, Naomi muttered. They're trying to make me look unstable. Hendricks sighed. And unfortunately, Miller's people are already working behind the scenes. He has lawyers, politicians, and even cops on his side. They're pushing a different story. Naomi gritted her teeth. What story? Lawson looked away. They're saying you attacked him. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. So let me get this straight. A white cop attacks a black judge in court, and now I'm the one on trial? Hendricks looked pained. You know how this works, Judge? Naomi did know. She had seen it too many times. The system was built to protect men like Miller. But she wasn't going to let them win. She stood. I need to go on the record. Lawson and Hendricks exchanged another glance. Judge, Lawson said carefully, you sure about that? If you speak out, it's going to escalate things. And if you think tonight was bad, Miller's people won't stop. Naomi clenched her fists. Good, she said. Neither will I. The next morning, Naomi stood at the courthouse steps. The press was already waiting. Dozens of reporters. Cameras flashing. Microphones shoved forward. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight up to them, her head held high, her voice strong. I know you all have questions, she said. So let me be clear. Silence fell. Every camera was locked on her. Yesterday, in my courtroom, I was attacked. Officer Travis Miller lost control, put his hands on me, and I defended myself. The reporters muttered. Some looked surprised that she was owning it so boldly. She continued. This is not about a courtroom fight. This is about accountability. This is about a police officer abusing his power, not just against me, but against countless black men and women before me. She stepped forward, her voice unwavering. I am not backing down. I will not be intimidated. And I will make sure Officer Miller and his accomplices face justice. More flashes. More murmurs. Then, a voice from the crowd. Judge Carter, are you afraid for your safety? Naomi paused. She thought of Miller, of Hayes, of the threats that were coming. Then she thought of Jamal Rivers. Beaten, bloody, left on the ground like his life meant nothing. She looked the reporter dead in the eye. No, she said. I'm not afraid. Because the only thing more dangerous than a corrupt system is a woman who refuses to be silent. The crowd erupted. Reporters scrambled for more questions. The video would go viral. The entire city would be watching now. And deep inside the police department, some very powerful people were getting nervous. But across town, in a dimly lit office, a phone rang. A man in a sharp suit answered. His face was calm, his voice smooth. She spoke. A pause. Then it's time to handle it. The call ended. And just like that, the war had officially begun. The war had officially begun. Naomi Carter knew that the moment she stepped away from those courthouse steps. The press had their headlines, the cameras had their footage, and now the entire country was watching. She should have felt victorious. But all she felt was a storm coming. That night, Naomi didn't go home. Instead, she checked into a hotel under an alias. After what happened with Hayes breaking into her house, she wasn't about to take any chances. She didn't trust the system to protect her. She barely trusted the police department at all. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she replayed the day's events in her mind. The fight in the courtroom, Hayes breaking into her house, the press conference, and then that call. She didn't know who it was, but someone powerful had just put things in motion, and she needed to find out who. The next morning, she met Vanessa Clark for breakfast at a small cafe in a quiet part of the city. Vanessa was already waiting, dressed in a sharp navy suit, her locks pulled into a bun. She didn't waste time on small talk. You made a hell of a move yesterday, Vanessa said as Naomi slid into the booth. Naomi sipped her coffee. I didn't have a choice. Vanessa's eyes darkened. And now? You've put a target on your back. Naomi sighed. It was already there. Vanessa leaned forward. Listen to me, Naomi. I've been digging into Miller's case for months. What happened in your courtroom wasn't just about Jamal Rivers. It's bigger. Way bigger. Naomi frowned. How big? Vanessa lowered her voice. I think Miller and his people are covering up something much worse. I don't have all the pieces yet, but I know this much. Jamal wasn't the first victim. Naomi's grip tightened on her coffee cup. You're saying there are more? Vanessa nodded. And not just cases of excessive force. I'm talking about people who disappeared. Witnesses who suddenly recanted their statements. Cops who turned up dead under mysterious circumstances. Naomi's stomach twisted. She had always known the system was corrupt. But this was something deeper. Darker. Vanessa slid a file across the table. I managed to get these from a source inside Internal Affairs. Read it. Then tell me if you still think this is just about one bad cop. Naomi hesitated, then opened the file. And what she saw made her blood run cold. The first page was a list of names. Men, women, all black. All had filed complaints against Officer Miller. Most were listed as unresolved. Some were labeled false accusations. But then, the last few names. Her breath caught. They weren't marked as unresolved. They were marked as deceased. Murder. Suicide. Accidents. One woman had been found in a burned-down apartment. A man was found in a river. No foul play ruled, but his family swore he never went near the water. Another had been shot in a botched robbery, but nothing was stolen. Naomi's hands clenched into fists. Vanessa's voice was low. This isn't about police brutality anymore, Naomi. This is a cover-up, and people are dying because of it. Naomi inhaled sharply. She had to do something, and she had to do it fast. That afternoon, Naomi went back to the courthouse. She was barely inside when her clerk, Denise, rushed up to her. You need to see this, Denise said, thrusting her phone forward. Naomi took it, and when she saw the screen, her stomach dropped. It was a news headline. Breaking, Judge Naomi Carter under investigation for courtroom incident. Naomi's jaw tightened. You've got to be kidding me. Denise shook her head. It's real. The police department announced it an hour ago. They're trying to push an investigation against you. Naomi's vision blurred with anger. They were flipping the script, trying to paint her as the aggressor. And the worst part? It was working. She scrolled through the comments. Another angry black woman. She should be removed from the bench. Miller was just defending himself. Naomi exhaled sharply. She had seen this play out too many times. It didn't matter if there was video proof of Miller attacking her. People would believe what they wanted to believe. Denise's voice was tight. They're coming after you, Judge. Naomi already knew. She glanced at her watch. In 1 hour, she had a hearing to oversee. And then, her phone vibrated. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Carter. A voice on the other end chuckled. A man's voice. Well, the man said. You just don't know when to quit, do you? Naomi's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? Just a friend, the voice said. A friend who thinks you should take a little vacation. Maybe drop this whole Miller thing before it gets messy. Naomi's blood turned to ice. Is that a threat? A pause. Then the voice said, It's a promise. Click. The line went dead. Naomi slowly lowered the phone. Her heart pounded. She turned to Denise. Get me Detective Lawson. Now. That night, Naomi sat in her office, waiting. Her blinds were drawn. The doors were locked. She wasn't taking any chances. 15 minutes later, there was a knock at her door. She opened it, and Detective Lawson stepped inside. He looked tense. You wanted to see me? Naomi took a deep breath. I got a call. A warning. Lawson frowned. From who? I don't know, Naomi admitted. But they want me to drop the Miller case. And they're making it clear that if I don't, things are going to get worse. Lawson exhaled. You need protection, Judge? Naomi shook her head. I don't need protection. I need answers. She grabbed the file Vanessa had given her and handed it to him. Lawson flipped through it, his face darkening. After a long silence, he muttered, Jesus Christ. Naomi crossed her arms. This is what we're dealing with. Lawson nodded slowly. And if this file is right, then Miller isn't just a corrupt cop. Naomi met his gaze. No, she said. He's a murderer. And at that moment, Naomi realized something. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting to stay alive. And she wasn't sure if she'd win. The weight of Naomi's last words hung in the air. He's a murderer. Detective Lawson exhaled, flipping through the file again. His jaw was clenched, his grip tight around the papers, as if trying to contain the fury bubbling beneath his calm exterior. Naomi watched him carefully. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked. Lawson didn't answer right away. Instead, he set the file down on her desk and pinched the bridge of his nose. "I had suspicions," he admitted, "but nothing concrete. Every time we got close, the evidence would disappear. Witnesses would go quiet. He looked up, or end up dead." Naomi leaned forward. "And now?" Lawson's eyes darkened. "Now, we have a trail. A trail of bodies. A trail of corruption. A trail that led straight to Officer Travis Miller." But Naomi knew something else. Miller wasn't acting alone. Someone higher up was pulling the strings. And she had just made herself their biggest threat. That night, Naomi didn't sleep. She sat in her hotel room, staring at the city lights through the window. Her mind was running too fast, too loud. Someone had broken into her home. Someone had sent a warning call. Someone was pulling the media strings to twist the courtroom attack in Miller's favor. And she knew this wasn't random. They wanted her to be afraid, to back off. She wasn't going to, but she wasn't going to be reckless either. She needed a plan. The next morning, Naomi made a decision. She wasn't going to wait for the system to do the right thing. She was going to force it. She needed leverage. So she went to the one person who could give it to her, Vanessa Clark. They met at a law office Naomi trusted, a small, private space owned by one of Vanessa's colleagues. No leaks, no eyes watching. Vanessa wasted no time. "You're doubling down," she said the moment Naomi sat down. Naomi nodded. "I don't have a choice." Vanessa sighed. "Yeah, you do. You could walk away, Naomi. You've already made your statement. The public is on your side for now." She leaned forward. "But if you keep pushing, they're going to hit back harder. They're not just going to come after your career. They're going to come after you." Naomi met her gaze. "Then let them come." Vanessa studied her, then shook her head. "Damn, you really don't know how to quit, do you?" Naomi smirked. "Not even a little." Vanessa sighed again, then slid a USB drive across the table. "What's this?" Naomi asked. Vanessa's face turned serious. "Evidence." Naomi's heart skipped. "Of what?" Vanessa exhaled. "Remember how I told you Miller wasn't just dirty? Well, I found something." Naomi plugged the USB into her laptop. The files loaded instantly. Video footage. And the moment she pressed play, her blood ran cold. The screen showed dashcam footage. A police car pulling over a young black man. The timestamp was from 2 years ago. The audio crackled. "Officer, step out of the car." "Man, sir, what's going on?" "Officer, now." Naomi recognized the voice. Officer Travis Miller. Her stomach twisted. The footage played on. The young man got out. He was scared, hands raised. Miller and another officer, a third cop Naomi didn't recognize, pushed him against the car. Then, suddenly, Miller pulled his gun. The man begged for his life. Then the screen went black. Naomi's breath caught. "Did they?" Vanessa nodded. "They killed him." She clicked another file. This one was bodycam footage. Different case. Different victim. Same pattern. Miller and his unit were executing people. And then, the footage was disappearing. Until now. Naomi stared at the screen, her hands trembling with fury. This is enough," she whispered. Vanessa exhaled. "It should be. But you know how this works." She met Naomi's gaze. "This only works if the right people see it." Naomi nodded slowly. She wasn't going to take this to internal affairs. She wasn't going to take this to the police department. No, she was going to take this straight to the public. That night, Naomi met with an investigative journalist. A trusted one. Someone who had exposed corruption before. She slid the USB across the table. The journalist plugged it in. And the moment they watched the footage, they looked at Naomi with shock and horror. "This," they whispered, "this will shake the whole city." Naomi nodded. "That's the plan." The next morning, everything exploded. The footage was leaked. It hit the news. It spread online. And suddenly, the city was on fire. Protests erupted. People were demanding answers. The police department scrambled to do damage control. Miller was officially put under investigation. His supporters? They were trying to bury the footage, calling it fake, saying it was taken out of context. But it was too late. The truth was out. And Naomi? She had just declared war. But that night, something happened. Naomi was leaving her office, heading toward her car. It was late, dark, too quiet. Then a noise. A footstep behind her. She turned just in time to see a shadow moving. Before she could react, a hand grabbed her. A cloth covered her mouth. Naomi struggled, kicked, fought. Then, darkness. Everything faded. The last thing she heard was a voice in her ear. You should have stayed quiet. And then, nothing. A pounding headache. Blurry vision. The first thing Naomi Carter felt was cold. Her body ached. Her arms were heavy, her wrists sore. She tried to move, but something was wrong. Her hands wouldn't move. Her wrists were tied. Her ankles too. Panic surged through her veins as she forced herself to focus. Where was she? She blinked hard, trying to clear her vision. A dim room. A basement. A warehouse. The air was thick with dust. The smell of gasoline and metal filled her nose. She wasn't alone. A faint sound, footsteps. Then a voice. You just couldn't let it go, could you? Naomi's heart stopped. She knew that voice. She turned her head slowly. And there he was. Officer Travis Miller. Standing just a few feet away, arms crossed. His usual cocky smirk plastered across his face. But there was something else in his eyes now. Something unhinged. Naomi swallowed, keeping her expression calm. She refused to let him see her fear. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice hoarse. Miller chuckled. Nah, the mistake was you thinking you could win. He stepped closer, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. Naomi tugged at the restraints, her wrists burning against the rough rope. She had to stay focused. She scanned the room. No windows. One door. A single flickering light bulb overhead. Her heart pounded. Think, Naomi. Think. Miller crouched down in front of her. You've been a real pain in my ass, Judge Carter. He tilted his head. You think exposing me changes anything? You think the city is going to rise up and suddenly fix itself? Naomi held his gaze. I think you're afraid. Miller's smirk twitched. Afraid, he laughed. Of you? Please. Naomi narrowed her eyes. You should be. Because you and I both know, you just made your last mistake. Miller's smile vanished. He grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. You don't get it, he hissed. I own this city. People like me, we don't go down. You? You're just a loudmouth with a robe and a gavel. Naomi spat in his face. Miller froze. For a split second, the room went completely silent. Then, his face twisted with rage. He slapped her. Hard. The impact whipped her head to the side, pain exploding across her cheek. Naomi refused to cry out. She would not break. Miller shook his head, wiping her spit off his face. That was a mistake. Naomi's lip was bleeding, but she smiled through it. No, she said. The mistake was thinking you could kill me and get away with it. Miller narrowed his eyes. Who said anything about killing you? Naomi's stomach clenched. Then, a second voice. She's right, though. Miller turned, frowning. Naomi looked past him, her pulse spiking. Another man stepped out of the shadows. Officer Daniel Hayes. The same man who had broken into her house. He smirked at Naomi, then glanced at Miller. You really think this ends with her just disappearing? Miller scoffed. That was the plan. Hayes shook his head. That's sloppy. She's too high profile now. You take out a judge, especially one who just exposed your mess. Every cop in the country will have a microscope on them. Miller frowned, then sighed. So what's your genius plan then? Hayes grinned. We make her the villain. Naomi's blood ran cold. Miller raised an eyebrow. How? Hayes leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Easy. We frame her. Make it look like she was dirty all along. Fake some evidence. A bribe here, a missing case file there. He shrugged. By the time we're done, she won't just be disgraced. She'll be in prison. Miller smirked. I like that. Naomi's pulse was racing. She had to get out of here. The door suddenly burst open. Miller and Hayes spun around. Naomi's heart leapt. A figure stood in the doorway. Detective Eric Lawson. And behind him, a team of officers. Guns drawn. Hands up. Now, Miller and Hayes froze. For the first time, Naomi saw fear in Miller's eyes. No way, he muttered. Lawson stepped forward. Travis Miller. Daniel Hayes. You're under arrest. Miller's jaw clenched. You can't do this. Lawson smirked. I already did. He held up his phone, a recording still playing. Naomi's breath caught. He had recorded everything. Every word. Every threat. Every admission. Miller's face twisted in rage. You set me up. Lawson shrugged. Funny. I was about to say the same thing about you. Hayes suddenly lunged for his gun. Bang. A single shot rang out. He collapsed to the floor, screaming, clutching his leg. Lawson's gun was still smoking. I told you to put your hands up. Miller's hands shot into the air. All right. All right. Don't shoot. Naomi's chest was rising and falling fast. She was still tied up. Still helpless. Lawson rushed to her side, cutting the ropes. You okay, Judge? Naomi nodded. Her hands were free. Her legs were free. She was free. She turned to Miller, watching as the officers dragged him down to his knees. He wasn't smirking anymore. He wasn't laughing anymore. Naomi stepped closer. Miller looked up at her, his breathing heavy. You think this changes anything? He sneered. You think I'm the only one? Naomi didn't blink. I don't care if you're the only one, she said. I just care that you're done. Miller clenched his jaw as the cuffs locked around his wrists. Naomi exhaled slowly, her heart still racing. It was over. Or at least, this part was. Because Miller was right about one thing. There were more. But for tonight, she had won. And she wasn't stopping now. The flashing lights of police cruisers lit up the night as Travis Miller and Daniel Hayes were hauled away in cuffs. The entire warehouse was now a crime scene. Officers swarming in, detectives barking orders, and crime scene technicians documenting every inch of the place. Naomi Carter stood in the center of it all, her wrists sore from the restraints, her body still trembling from the adrenaline. But she wouldn't let herself collapse. Not yet. Detective Eric Lawson stepped up beside her, watching as Miller was shoved into the back of a police car. That was close, he muttered. Naomi exhaled. Too close. Lawson turned to her. We need to get you checked out. Hospital. Precautionary measures. Naomi shook her head. No hospital. Not yet. Lawson frowned. Naomi, I need to finish this. Her voice was firm. If you think Miller and Hayes were the only ones pulling strings, you're wrong. There's someone higher up, someone protecting them. And they're still out there. Lawson rubbed his jaw. You really don't know how to let things rest, do you? Naomi smirked. Not even a little. Lawson sighed. All right. What's the plan? Naomi turned, staring at the blacked-out police car where Miller Saturday first. We make sure he doesn't walk away from this. The next morning, the city woke up to the news of Travis Miller's arrest. Every major network was covering it. Breaking. Officer Travis Miller and Officer Daniel Hayes arrested for corruption, kidnapping, and attempted murder. Judge Naomi Carter survives attack in ongoing investigation into police corruption. Shockwaves in the department. Who else is involved? Naomi sat in her office at the courthouse, scrolling through the headlines. Her phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa Clark. They're already working on damage control. Be ready. Naomi was ready. Because this wasn't just about Miller anymore. This was about who was protecting him. And she had one more card to play. The interrogation room. Miller sat in the cold metal chair, hands cuffed to the table, eyes dark with anger. Across from him, Naomi. Lawson leaned against the wall, arms crossed, letting her take the lead. Naomi tapped a folder on the table. You know what this is? Miller didn't answer. She opened it, revealing the list of names. The victims. The missing files. The cover-ups. Miller's face didn't change. You're going away for a long time, Naomi said. But how long depends on one thing. Miller's jaw clenched. You want me to talk? Naomi nodded. You give us names. You tell us who in the department was protecting you. Who in City Hall was covering for you. Who was helping you bury bodies. Miller smirked. And if I don't? Naomi leaned in, smirking back. You'll take the fall alone. Miller stared at her, the realization sinking in. The silence stretched. Then, his face cracked. A small, bitter laugh escaped his lips. You really think I'm the only one? He muttered. Lady, you have no idea how deep this goes. Naomi didn't blink. Then tell me. Miller exhaled. Then he started talking. And what he said changed everything. The bombshell. It took hours. But by the time Naomi left the interrogation room, she had everything she needed. And none of it was good. She and Lawson sat in a quiet office, going over Miller's statement. It's worse than we thought, Lawson muttered, rubbing his temples. Naomi nodded. Way worse. Because the names Miller gave up? They weren't just cops. They were judges, politicians, business owners. A whole damn network of power built on fear, corruption, and blood. Miller was just one piece of the puzzle. And now? They had a new target. The man who had been pulling the strings all along. The police commissioner. Commissioner Richard Monroe. The war isn't over. That night, Naomi sat in her hotel room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She had survived. She had taken Miller down. But the battle wasn't over. Because now, she was going after the king. And this time, she wasn't going to stop until the whole damn system burned. The war wasn't over. Naomi Carter had taken down Travis Miller. She had exposed Daniel Hayes. But now, she was going after the real power. Commissioner Richard Monroe. A man so deeply connected, so well protected, that even saying his name in an accusation was dangerous. But Naomi wasn't afraid. She had the truth. And she was about to drop a bomb on the entire system. The city reacts. The fallout from Miller's confession hit the city like a wildfire. News channels were nonstop. Travis Miller names corrupt officials. Investigation expands. Shockwaves through the police department. Who will be next? Protests had started outside the courthouse. People weren't just angry. They were demanding justice, demanding resignations, demanding arrests. And Naomi? She was standing at the center of it all. The threats begin. That morning, she arrived at her office to find her desk trashed, papers shredded, files missing, and on top of everything, a single envelope. Inside, a single bullet. No note, no signature, just a message. Stop now. Naomi clenched her fists. They were getting desperate, and desperate men made mistakes. She grabbed her phone and called Detective Lawson. It's starting, she said. Lawson's voice was grim. I figured. Miller's confession put the whole damn department in panic mode. Do we have enough? She asked. There was a pause. Then yes. But we need to move fast. Naomi's heart pounded. Then let's bring down Monroe. The plan. Lawson met her at a safe house. It wasn't just him this time. Sitting in the room were two other detectives, both known for going after corruption. A black man named Detective James Reddick and a Latino woman named Detective Sandra Perez. They had seen Naomi on the news. They had seen the threats against her. And now, they were here to finish this. Reddick spoke first. Miller's confession gave us names, dates, accounts. But we need one more thing. Naomi folded her arms. What's missing? Perez slid a laptop across the table. Direct proof that Monroe was pulling the strings. Naomi exhaled. Where do we find it? Perez smirked. In his private office. Naomi froze. Then, slowly, she understood. You're saying we break in? Reddick grinned. Not us. You. Breaking into power. That night, Naomi did something no judge should ever do. She broke into the police commissioner's office. With help, of course. Lawson and Reddick got her inside. Perez disabled the security cameras. And Naomi? She went straight for Monroe's files. It didn't take long. The man was powerful, but he was also arrogant. He had kept everything. Bribes, orders, direct memos linking him to every corrupt cop in the city. And at the top of it all, a signed document, a direct payment order, to Travis Miller, for handling a situation. And the date? The same day Jamal Rivers was beaten. Naomi's blood boiled. This wasn't just about corruption anymore. This was about murder. She pulled out her phone, took pictures of everything, and then she walked out of there like she belonged there. Because soon, this would belong to her. The final blow. The next morning, Naomi held a press conference. She didn't wait. She didn't hesitate. She walked to the microphone, cameras rolling, the city holding its breath. And she dropped the bomb. I have direct proof, she said, voice strong, steady, unshaken. Proof that Commissioner Richard Monroe has been covering for violent officers. Proof that he ordered the suppression of cases involving police brutality. Proof that he paid officers to commit crimes. The reporters exploded. Questions shouted. Chaos everywhere. But Naomi wasn't finished. I am officially requesting a federal investigation into Monroe and his network of corruption. A new headline was already forming. Police Commissioner under federal investigation. Judge Carter exposes citywide conspiracy. And just like that, Monroe was finished. The fallout. That night, Naomi sat in her hotel room, watching the news. She saw Monroe's face, saw how pale he looked, how tense. They had him. And then, her phone rang. She answered. A familiar voice on the other end. You did it. Naomi smiled. Vanessa, it's not over yet, Naomi said. But it's close. There was a pause. Then, Vanessa chuckled. You know, Naomi, she said, I think you just changed history. Naomi exhaled. Maybe. But she wasn't done yet. Because one thing was still missing. Justice. For Jamal Rivers. For all the people who had suffered before him. And until that happened, Naomi Carter wasn't stopping. The war was nearly over. Naomi Carter had done the impossible. She had exposed Commissioner Richard Monroe, the man who had protected racist cops, the man who had orchestrated cover-ups, bribes, and murder. The city was on fire. Protests outside the mayor's office. Federal investigators swarming the police department. Headlines screaming for resignations. But Naomi knew one thing. Until Jamal Rivers got justice, this wasn't over. The final trial. The courtroom was packed. News cameras lined the back. Protesters filled the halls outside. This was the trial of the decade. The People versus Travis Miller. Naomi sat in her judge's seat, staring down at the man who had tried to kill her. The man who had laughed after beating Jamal Rivers nearly to death. Now, he was in an orange jumpsuit. His smirk was gone. His arrogance? Shattered. The prosecution laid out everything. The video footage. The witness testimonies. The documents linking him to Monroe. The jury didn't take long. They returned with a verdict within 3 hours. The courtroom held its breath as the foreman stood. Naomi looked down at Miller. This is it. The foreman cleared his throat. On the charge of aggravated assault, we find the defendant guilty. Miller's jaw tightened. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Miller's face turned pale. And then, the final charge. The one Naomi had waited for. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant. A pause. Then guilty. The room erupted. People cheered. Reporters scrambled. Jamal Rivers, sitting in the front row with his mother, broke down in tears. Naomi didn't move. She stared at Miller. He refused to look at her. She lifted her gavel. And with one final slam, she spoke the words she had been waiting to say. Officer Travis Miller, you are sentenced to life in prison. The city changes. 1 week later, Monroe was arrested. The entire top brass of the police department was wiped out. New leadership was brought in. Federal oversight was permanent. Policies changed. Laws shifted. For the first time in decades, real change was happening. No more cover-ups. No more immunity for dirty cops. It wasn't perfect, but it was justice. The final moment. Naomi sat in her office, staring at the sunset through her window. A knock at the door. She looked up. Come in. The door opened, and Jamal Rivers stepped inside. He looked stronger now. No longer the terrified teenager who had been left for dead. He walked forward, his eyes shining with something Naomi hadn't seen before. Hope. I just wanted to say thank you, he said softly. Naomi smiled. You don't have to thank me. Jamal swallowed. No, I do. You didn't have to fight for me. But you did. You fought for all of us. Naomi exhaled, emotion tightening in her chest. She reached out, shaking his hand. Jamal gripped hers tightly. And in that moment, Naomi knew. This was worth it. Justice had been served. Travis Miller was in prison for life. Commissioner Richard Monroe had been arrested. The corrupt system that had protected dirty cops for decades was finally crumbling. But Naomi Carter knew the truth. The fight was never really over. Because for every Miller and Monroe that got taken down, there were others. Men in suits. Men in uniforms. Men in power. Still watching. Still waiting for their moment to take back control. Naomi Carter wasn't going to let that happen. The governor's call. It came 3 days after Miller's sentencing. Naomi was sitting in her office, going through new case files. There was still work to be done. New police reform bills had been proposed. More investigations into past cover-ups had been launched. Then, her phone rang. She glanced at the number. Unknown caller. She answered. Judge Carter. A deep, smooth voice spoke on the other end. Judge Carter. This is Governor William Hart. Naomi sat up straighter. The governor? I wanted to call you personally, Hart continued. What you've done these past few weeks. It's historic. Naomi stayed silent, waiting. Hart exhaled. I've been following your work for a while. Your integrity. Your strength. Then, the bombshell. I want you to consider running for Attorney General. Naomi's breath caught. She had never expected this. Attorney General? The highest law enforcement official in the state. She'd have the power to prosecute cases against corrupt officials, to push for real policy changes. To oversee police departments across the state. For the first time in weeks, Naomi was speechless. A hard decision. That night, Naomi met Vanessa Clark for dinner. She needed advice. She told Vanessa about the governor's offer. Vanessa leaned back, swirling her wine glass. Damn, Attorney General. She smirked. Didn't I tell you that you were making history? Naomi sighed. It's not that simple. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. What's stopping you? Naomi exhaled. Power changes people, Vanessa. I've seen it. I don't want to become them. Vanessa studied her. And you think staying on the bench will stop that? Naomi shrugged. I know this role. I know how to fight from here. Vanessa leaned forward. Naomi, if you really want to change the system, you need to be in the rooms where the laws are written. Naomi fell silent. Because deep down, she knew Vanessa was right. One last visit. The next morning, Naomi drove to a small apartment complex on the east side of the city. She knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened. Jamal Rivers. He looked surprised. Judge Carter. Naomi smiled. Can I come in? Jamal nodded quickly, stepping aside. His apartment was small but neat. Family photos lined the walls. His mother was in the kitchen, cooking. Naomi turned to him. I wanted to check in on you. Jamal smiled. I'm doing better. Started classes again. Naomi felt warmth in her chest. That's good to hear. Jamal hesitated. And you? Naomi sighed. That's actually why I came. She sat down. Jamal, if you could change one thing about the system that hurt you, what would it be? Jamal's expression turned serious. He didn't answer right away. He looked down, thinking. Then he spoke. I'd make sure it never happens to anyone else. Naomi swallowed hard. And in that moment, she made her decision. The announcement. The following day, Naomi Carter stepped in front of a podium. Cameras flashed. The entire city was watching. She took a breath. Then she spoke. For too long, this system has been built to protect the powerful at the expense of the people. Her voice was steady. That is why, today, I am announcing my candidacy for Attorney General. The crowd erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Naomi lifted her chin. She had spent her career fighting for justice in the courtroom. Now, she was going to fight for it everywhere. A new battle begins. That night, Naomi stood on her balcony, looking out over the city. The lights flickered. The streets were alive. She had won one war, but another was beginning. She had just declared war on an entire system. And she knew they would come for her. But she was ready, because Naomi Carter was done playing by their rules. Now, she was making her own. And this time, she wasn't stopping until the whole damn system changed. Naomi Carter had never sought power. She had never craved the spotlight, never imagined herself as a politician. But now, she was standing in front of thousands, announcing her run for Attorney General. And she was ready to burn the old system to the ground. The backlash. The moment her campaign launched, the attacks began. News pundits twisted her words. Political opponents called her too radical. Anonymous sources started digging into her past, looking for anything to discredit her. They pulled up old cases, tried to frame her as anti-police, even accused her of inciting division. But Naomi? She didn't flinch, because for the first time in her life, she had an entire city behind her. People were donating to her campaign in record numbers. Community leaders endorsed her, and the families of Miller's victims, the ones who had suffered in silence for so long, stood by her. They knew the truth. She wasn't fighting for herself. She was fighting for them. The final threat. 1 week before the election, Naomi was leaving a campaign event when it happened. A black SUV cut her off in an alley. 2 men stepped out. Dark suits. Cold eyes. One of them smiled. Judge Carter, we need to talk. Naomi didn't move. She already knew what this was. A warning. One last chance to back down. The taller man stepped forward. You're making enemies, Judge. Powerful ones. Naomi crossed her arms. Good. His smile faded. You don't get it, do you? The system isn't built to lose. It adapts. It waits. It outlasts people like you. Naomi smirked. Not this time. The man's jaw tightened. Walk away now, and you won't regret it. Stay in the race, he shrugged. And accidents happen. Naomi's fists clenched. Then, headlights. A second later, 2 police cruisers pulled up behind them. Detective Eric Lawson stepped out, gun at his side. Is there a problem here? The men in suits didn't move. Then, without a word, they turned and got back in their SUV. As they drove off, Naomi exhaled. Lawson watched them go. They're scared. Naomi nodded. They should be. Election night. The votes poured in. For hours, the race was too close to call. Naomi sat in a private room with Vanessa and her team, watching the numbers update. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, at midnight, the final precincts reported, and the news anchor's voice came through the screen. Breaking, Naomi Carter has officially been elected as the next Attorney General. The room exploded. Cheers. Applause. People hugging. Naomi exhaled. She had won. But more importantly, the people had won. 1 year later, the system didn't change overnight. But Naomi kept fighting. She launched the biggest police reform initiative in state history. She prosecuted corrupt officers and officials who had been untouchable for decades. She secured justice for families who thought they'd never see it. And most of all, she proved that one person can make a difference. The final scene. One afternoon, Naomi was leaving a meeting when she spotted someone waiting outside her office. A young man. Tall. Strong. Jamal Rivers. Now a college graduate. He smiled as she approached. Madam Attorney General. Naomi grinned. Jamal, it's been a while. He nodded. I just wanted to say, thank you. Again. Naomi shook her head. No, Jamal. You're the reason I kept fighting. He smiled. Then I guess we're both just getting started. Naomi laughed. I like the sound of that. And as they shook hands, Naomi knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something even bigger. A new era. A better future. And she was ready.